If you were explaining to an audience member like what a commission is, how would you describe it?
It's well, technically, what it is anytime someone is paid to create a musical composition. And that payment could be as little as a penny, and it would be considered a commission. And in fact, I've heard of things, transactions being made like that when a composer is still young, but they need a commission on their resume, and somebody wants to get something from them but doesn't necessarily have the money to fund it. A lot of times that will be the way that they go about it. So that's technically what it is. Anytime a piece of work is paid for, or is the money is offered up front, and there's some kind of contract and negotiation. But in terms of what it is actually for the composer, that's different every single time. There's many different ways in which we get work as composers. Sometimes they are through, friends and acquaintances. Sometimes they are through larger organizations that seek one out. And then sometimes they're even consortiums, which are, kind of interesting to me in this day and age, because that's grassroots movement and creating new music. It's both the performers and the composers really, teaming up together to find solutions for ways to pay for for these works, and to get them heard in broader context than they would necessarily if it was just a single individual or a group commissioning the piece. um, but like I said, it's we're we're all cobbling it together every single time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. In this case, we had a chance to meet with some of the musicians and the person that commissioned the piece and kind of have a conversation about, what it would be like and what's the intention behind it. Is that usually the case, or is that kind of a unique circumstance?
It can be. I've certainly known about a lot of commissions that are for somebody, in honor of somebody in particular. Dedicatees, and sometimes the composer chooses that. Other times the organization chooses that. They have a special donor on the board in whom they want a gift, and, this is a great gift. So yeah, and in terms of talking through the commission with an organization or a particular person to whom a piece is dedicated, I would say that's a fairly common procedure. And it's something that I certainly revel in, because I don't think the music that I write is supposed to be just about what's on my mind at that particular moment. I think it's my reaction to things that are happening. It's my response to what's happening in the world, and in these cases with individuals. And just having that platform of being able to bounce ideas off of other people and see what sticks and what doesn't, is very helpful. um, I actually have a little bit of experience in the musical theater world, which is a very different animal than what we're used to as contemporary classical composers. Um, whereby when you write a work for musical theater, that work is vetted so many times before it will even be permitted to be shown, much less put up. Um, and not that I've actually gotten to that place where we've put something up, but I've gone through that vetting process numerous times, readings and showcases and things like that. And it's really a very interesting difference in approach, where you know in order for a musical to go up, it has to somehow be a, vetted to the point where the people who are producing and the people who are putting on the show know that people are going to want to come see this. you know Whereas, when we write music, we're writing music, we're trying to stretch boundaries sometimes. Sometimes we're, trying to stretch our own boundaries, trying to stretch the boundaries of what is possible or what the sound worlds are, and not always necessarily focused on what is the audience going to get out of that. So in I like to live in this happy medium. you know, I don't like to think of, writing as an act of, kind of self fulfillment. And I also don't like to think of as an act of completely giving it over either. There is this, this marriage of the two where you're thinking, okay, here are my ideas. Now, how are those communicable? How are those going to reach somebody in the beginning? And by no means am I against the notion that a piece should have to be heard more than once in order for somebody to get more and more fulfillment out of that piece. I mean, I believe that's the case with any piece of good music, whether it's a piece of classical contemporary music, a song, a jazz standard. I mean, it doesn't matter what it is. Anything with some sophistication requires multiple listenings to get more out of it. But I also feel like there has to be that initial introduction, that that certain something that allows an audience to be able to communicate, or to be able to feel invited into that experience, um, somehow. So,
This is a really interesting conversation, I find. So along the side of like creative process, right? So in this case, the commission is for the players, for our ensemble, but also having somebody in mind that you dedicated the piece to.
right.
So is there any kind of a crossover or conflict in your mind in creating this piece? You're writing for the players, but also for the person in mind, for whom this piece is for.
Right.
And in terms of what you just said, it triggers something in my head about music theater, that it has to be vetted and it has to be understood whether the public would like it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I just recently had a conversation with a friend of mine who's a violinist, and we were talking about performing, how one can look effortlessly performing a piece, but the piece is actually very difficult. And whether the public gets satisfaction seeing the piece being difficultly or performed with difficulty versus sort of watching the piece and say, oh, that was so easy, or it looks so easy. So which is more satisfying? And whether as a performer, of course, we need to be a sincere and authentic player, musician first, right? We don't put on an act just because we want to put on a good show. But on a separate level, do we add something extra just to be in front of people so that they feel something extra? So in terms of creating a piece, there's a good balance of what is authentic and sincere to you.
Yes.
But is there an element of thinking, oh, would people like it, or how would the audience perceive this, or do I want to add something theatrical, so that I just trigger that question in my head when I listen.
So it's a lot of thoughts to kind of compress here.
Sorry, my head goes into.
No. That's the way my head works too. And then I have to deal with it on a page, and that's the hard work. So yeah, I mean, I think when you ask if dealing with somebody whom it's being dedicated to, if that is makes it more difficult, am I understanding correctly? Does that make it more
No, like at any given creative process, do you have like a parallel thinking? This is for this, for example, or I'm writing for the four musicians,
right?
Or, yeah.
So I think the way I look at it is, I take from each source what is usable, what can translate into some kind of sound. Certainly the ensemble, the makeup of two strings, a piano, and a clarinet, is a particular sound, and knowing the way that you play and the things that you've played certainly creates a sonic image in my own mind. So there is that relationship between performer and composer when composer does know performer, that is just kind of automatic. You know, I know the sound. I know what I'm working with. Not only the instruments but the players themselves. And so yes, that does motivate a certain a certain kind of sound or a certain approach or a certain type of piece. In talking to Judy, certainly, especially since we were talking to her at the beginning of all of this, pandemic nonsense and some of the struggles that each of us are dealing with in this, and hearing her talk about wanting to hear something having to do with healing, and the idea that through all of this that we are going to discover ways of being more whole and possibly approaching the way we live in a healthier manner. Those are all things that I think we all think about daily. We all run ourselves into the ground with our routines, and then we all kind of get back to this place where, like, well, we've got to take care of our bodies. We have to take care of our minds, so that we don't just become a victim of whatever it is our obsession. So, and for some, I think this situation of being locked indoors and is really inhibiting. It's very, it feels like almost like being put in jail to some folks. And what I think what she was saying, to a certain extent, is this, first of all, there's hope in there, but there's also this: is there an opportunity here? Is there an opportunity to heal within this quiet? No longer are there, highways full of cars and stores full of people and and the hustle and bustle to get somewhere or get home. And now there's more time for reflection, there's more time for meditation, more time to focus on one's body. And in fact, we're forced to focus on our bodies. We're putting masks on, we're being mindful of others when we do that. And so there is this kind of natural environment for healing. So yeah, I mean, all of those things were certainly in my mind when I had written this. And so when you talk about, is there a conflict sometimes between what these two forces, this dedicatee and this ensemble and maybe some other ones, are there some conflicts? Well, certainly there are, but they get resolved. I mean, having heard you play, gypsy music, with, in Civitas, of course, I mean, I want to start with flames, but this situation is, and this moment we find ourselves in is not that. And, so I find that I'm starting in this place and knowing that, I want some of that to be part of it. I want there to be some fire, some flame somewhere in this piece, and I know I can work towards that still with this idea of, healing and breathing and heartbeat at its core. So I try to allow the piece as it starts, as it begins, to influence the entire piece, but where it goes and the things that I can explore, I leave open, so that I might get there.
Yeah, I guess that was one of the things I was gonna ask was, whether it's a commission or just a free piece, is there kind of a trajectory that you try to follow, or is there just this element of the unknown that comes up?
It's always a little bit of both. My favorite quote in the world, that uh, I think I say probably every time I talk to somebody about this is, Boulez was I can't remember if it was when he was talking with Augusta Reed Thomas on the stage of Orchestra Hall, or if it was, I heard it through the grapevine. I can't even remember where I heard it. But he said, I love to make plans. so I can destroy them. you know, and to a certain extent, that was like a big weight off of a composer's shoulders. With an iconic composer like Boulez, who everybody reveres. I mean, he's got megaphones for ears, and he can hear everything, and and then he can conceive of everything, and yet he too has plans that go awry, that get destroyed, and that where he finds new opportunities in the moment and inspiration. That's kind of a freeing thing. I've always been. My father was a composer too, and he was very, very planned. He would make very beautiful, detailed sketches of what a piece was going to do before he even started, and then he'd follow the plan like it was the blueprint for an erector set, and he'd get to the finish, and then he'd be done and off to the next thing. And I sometimes wish I could be like him. It seemed like so easy for him, but I've had to find my own process through all of this. I've gone through several different phases of like these hyper plans with even spreadsheets and numbers, and trying to calculate distances and lengths, and I am very numerical as a thinker. But then I've also done things very freewheeling, like, okay, this is how the piece starts. Okay, jot down some ideas. Where do you think this could go? Okay, well, now let's keep writing. And, sometimes I can actually plot out, okay, it's going to land here. Other times it's like, I can't get past measure 19, because it just, even though I know this is some of the things I want to try, I'm not quite sure if they fit yet. I'm not quite sure how I want to get there. So, it's a lot of give and take. It's a lot of, using the various resources that I've garnered over a long, career to be able to, use at my will. And it's, sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's really hard. So I wish I could predict.
Have you had a piece where you actually heard the beginning and the end and the middle and just wrote it?
Nope. I mean, for me, it always starts at the beginning. I'm very chronological that way. I don't hear the end of a piece, and I don't get all excited about the 2D section. Um, I I really feel like from the beginning it was always for me about DNA. This musical idea that captures my attention for whatever reason. And I spend a while trying to figure out what it is. I play with it a little bit. I write a minute of music maybe, and try to understand what that idea is. What's at the core of it? Why is it special? And then that usually starts to tell me things. Whereas, if I start with an idea and I think, oh, it could go here, well, I haven't, investigated, all of the ways that it gets there. And, certainly I could find a way to get there, but I like it when the idea leads me there rather than me trying to push the idea somewhere where it may or may not want to go. And, it's different for everyone. But the way my processes work, the very kind of subtle, nuanced transitions, sometimes the blurred lines between what's a transition and what is actual, substantive sectional, statement, those that requires that I have that level of flexibility to, in getting from, place to place. So, and oftentimes as I write, like, I'll get to stopping places where it's like, okay, thought it was going to do this and it's not doing that, and it doesn't want to do that. And so then it's almost like, the process, kind of starts over again in a way where, you're at this place with this idea. Okay, now since it didn't want to go there, what does it want to do? And then you got to kind of rethink that, the DNA of the mutated gene, So and then sometimes once I get to that place, then it's like, oh, here comes a whole section of music, and you know it's easy as pie. But
So when you say DNA, what is the DNA looking like for this piece? Okay,
so
describe it.
so the DNA is really, I mean, if I was going to put it in layman's terms, it's the heartbeat. There is this pulsing that I heard from the very beginning, and I really, this was brought about by talking with Judy, just about this idea of healing, and thinking about ourselves being in our homes, and sometimes it's so utterly quiet, like a quiet that we haven't heard in maybe our lifetimes, because there is no street noise there. At times there, maybe everybody is in their rooms just kind of doing the down thing, or they're on their screen, so you don't hear anything in the house. um, and what do you hear when you don't hear anything else? You hear things like breath, you hear things like your heartbeat sometimes, and that can be kind of the place where you do rejuvenate, where you do heal. I mean, meditative practice is all about just being in present moment, and following breath and following heartbeat, and being mindful of the gift of that life force kind of pulsing through us. So um, I don't know where the idea came from, but it just started very simply with the piano. And I'm a pianist, full disclosure, and so usually I write these big, gargantuan piano parts. And so far, first 3 minutes, Winston is not going to be earning his pay.
That's not good. We have to make him work.
I will eventually. Don't worry. we we still have, we still like to push each other that way. But it just starts with this very simple melodic line, fifth and a semitone. And evolving from there is just the clarinet and the violin playing this in some kind of an even pulse. And then and then the pulse in the violin and the clarinet changes a little bit. So it's this idea of these evolving pulses. They change speed and tempo, and then they change form. At one point, the violin is playing, just like this, arpeggiated figure under which, the others are doing, So that is really the core of the work, and that in and of itself isn't like a melodic idea, but there are melodies that spring out of those moments, and that will take over at times, and then will kind of subsume back into that heartbeat. And so right now, what I'm experimenting with are all of the various ways in which that pulsing can be explored within this ensemble. All the different types of sounds, and the images that they evoke as well, because it's not all necessarily heartbeat. It could be water too. I have this image of a drop of water going into a lake, and the ripples spreading, and then if you do another one, maybe the ripples are at a different speed, or maybe they the two sets of ripples conflict with each other, and you get some kind of interference and disturbance of those. And so like this visual idea of pulsing and various pulsings, and all of the influence that one has on the other and how that feels is really kind of at the core of this work. And so the idea, although it can be visual or philosophical, for me has to become visceral. You have to feel it. You have to be able to somehow relate to it listening to this piece of music without being told what it is. And so, and that's, I think that's the hardest thing always, how do you make, something that is, rather nuanced and sophisticated as an idea come across as something that is just an experience that you don't have to explain.
I think a lot of it depends on the performers also, right?
Mhm.
Because
Oh,
I,
absolutely.
as I listen to the, little excerpts, I think it's really beautiful.
Well, thank you.
And of course, I haven't seen the rest, but I kind of have an idea of what I would do with the material.
Mhm.
And I really hear the color and I hear what you're trying to get out of it. And I think a lot of it, like you said, we have to have a visceral connection to the music
Mhm.
as a performer. Like I've done my share of contemporary music. Not everything that, at the first play or after the first week studying it, I love it. But
Mhm.
I always try to, on some level, to make a connection, whether it's
Mhm.
emotional or intellectual. I
Yeah.
think without that level of connection, I wouldn't be able to play the piece in a way that I am convinced. So, but if I'm not convinced, nobody else is going to be convinced.
Well,
There's always that layer of finding the visceral connection on
yeah.
whatever level that is.
Well, and that's, a large part of my career has been about finding and connecting with people who have those values. Um, because I think my music does kind of rest not on my merits only, but on the merits of the people who are approaching it. And you could say that about any piece of music, certainly. But some music comes off uh, with less attention. Let me just say it that way. And it's, not for better or for worse, but I'm just saying some music can come off with less attention. And some music requires a great deal of attention to, the microcosm of each individual note and measure. And so, knowing that there is a proliferation of detail in my work that I try to be very detailed and nuanced about the way that I notate things in order to get certain things to come out. That's what makes it kind of hard. I mean, you look at it on the surface, and sometimes people think, I'll practice that the week before the performance. It'll be fine, and then they find themselves in a world of trouble, at the 11th hour because it's like, oh, I didn't anticipate this, and and or maybe they get through everything and they feel confident playing it, but they don't understand the piece, and to a certain extent that does go for any music. There has to be that commitment to really trying to understand how this works, because there are not enough markings in the world to be able to describe a piece of music, nor could there be any number of words in the world to describe a person's influence on the world, or their personality. I mean, words only go so far. So that's where there's a really there has to be this meeting of the minds between the performers and the composers. Not that the performers need to abide by the composer's will, but that they understand the accent of the language, and that the composers, when writing for the performers, understand how they play, or and if you're not writing for a specific ensemble, you just have to understand the ensemble itself, in a kind of general way. But when you are writing for specific people, there is that added advantage of having something even a little bit more intimate, because you know how they express certain things, even if you're not thinking, oh, well, they always play this phrase this way. Now it's more of a kind of background kind of thinking. You know the sound, the people, you've seen them, heard them, felt them, through music, and so then there is that that finer nuance, I think, to what you write for them.
I think it's really exciting to have this two-way street, two-way conversation. When
Mm-hmm.
I played Ensemble with Boulez, as you mentioned, I worked with him a lot, and he would sing the phrase, hum the phrase, because he would write the indications as play the rhythm irregularly. So how would you interpret that, right?
Right.
He would hum it a little, and I would try to imitate how he would want that. So
Mm-hmm.
that was like really memorable, so memorable. I mean, of course, he's a genius and he's a great man, and I felt like vividly when I was playing his music, I saw colors.
Mm,
Never like that with any other pieces, like
mm,
really bright colors in certain sections.
wow.
And I thought that was really interesting because I usually don't see colors, you know, especially if we play something and it's more of an emotional connection, or I instinctively know how to, you know, phrase something, or at
Mm,
least I don't know if it's to the likings of the composers, but at least I know this is how I feel. But
right.
with this music, you know, I was very stressed because it was not only technically hard, but also it's burlesque. And
And he
but
was there.
somehow, you know, the more I got to know it, the more I saw colors. I don't think I ever told him that.
Yeah.
But to me, it was always interesting that I didn't know that that was a level of visual
Yeah.
effect that I, you know, had on me. So I
It,
don't know if you had any experience like that when you're composing, suddenly new sensations came to you.
yeah. I mean, it's I've never had a confrontation with the synesthesia, you know, that association. I certainly think in colors, but I don't actually see them. You know, I'm wondering whether, you know, you want to get tested and see if you have a little bit of that. That would be that would be a pretty remarkable thing to find out. Because you know, I've always been jealous of Ravel, who apparently had this, 100%. And you know, yeah, it's a very apparent with Ravel's music too. You know, there is just this sense of shading, and you know, because it is so vivid and his idea is so clear, it can be associated with these very subtle hues. You just know by hearing the figure how you're supposed to play it. You know, in you know, just like, you know, when you see, you know, two colors against one another in a room, that they were just meant to be. Um, so yeah, and I do. I mean, I have a great love for color, and sound color, and as a performer, I mean, that's something that, you know, I never get enough of. I mean, that's something that excites me when I'm practicing a piece. You know, I've recently been, you know, just kind of going through a transcription of the Adagietto from Mahler's Five, um, and you know, just the expansiveness of the range of expression there, you know, is it's so intense, right? I mean, this is one of the things that, you know, drove audiences off in the beginning because it was too much for them. But you know, but in addition to that, you know, that dramatic scope, I find just a tremendous amount of color. You know, all of a sudden, you know, out of this, you know, wash of gray comes this, you know, silvery, you know, little passage, you know, and you know, Mahler had that ability to kind of transform something enormous into something very intimate and beautiful. Um, so yeah, it's something that I adore and something that I aspire to, certainly. I mean, I would say, if I had to, you know, cite the beginnings, the origins of my interest in writing, it was really the French Impressionists. That, you know, that just kind of that mystery, that that looking beyond the boundaries of our natural existence. You know, I often think about, you know, the universe and space and travel and, you know, speed and time and, you know, all those things. I love to think, you know, in surreal terms too, and those are things that are, you know, I often associate with those types of sounds as well. So
Yeah, I find it interesting what you said about how, you know, there's not enough markings in the world to really convey what you mean. And I was just thinking of the pictures you sent us of the score, all handwritten
mm.
sketches. Was that is that how you always start a piece, with those hand?
Absolutely. You know, I was starting to feel some peer pressure. I mean, you know, there are even composers older than me who are like, you know, screw this, you know, you just put it in finale and the score's done when you're done. And, you know, like, why are you wasting all this time? You could be writing 5 pieces instead of 4 a year, you know? And, you know, I think I might have tried it for about 5 seconds and I'm like, this feels horrible. it just there feel it, I feel like I'm not even writing somehow. And that's not a value judgment on anybody who decides to do it that way. I mean, if it works for you, it works for you. That's great. But for me, it feels like I'm going through a sheet of plastic to get to the stuff that I really want to do. And I need the free space of, and I don't know if you were able to see in some of the scans I sent, but I use 11 by 17 paper. I like to see a lot of music on a page, so that I don't have to keep flipping pages, and then I can think in longer expanses too. And then I like to do things like this that mean absolutely nothing to anybody but myself. Where I start just jotting things down that I've done. I jot things down that might be. I jot things, let's try to organize some things, and then I start to find some, connections, and then I go. They look, in some ways like Beethoven's sketches. His were not like, oh, I'm starting here, going there, and he would like write a melody, and then he'd exit out, and then he'd write another one, or revise a little bit and figure out how that melody was going to go to that melody, and that's I somehow relate to him on that level. Just in terms of the working process, because there is this level of damn it, that's not right, do it again, and then none of it ends up getting in the score, and but it's that's part of the that's part of the process that you have to learn to live with and learn to embrace, and the older you get, hopefully the wiser you get about being accepting of whatever that is for you. But yeah, paper it is for me. I've certainly decided on that, and it's not because I'm old-fashioned. I've actually found through the course of this pandemic, I'm not near the Luddite I thought I was. So
You don't use software at all. From beginning to the end, you use paper.
From beginning to end, I use paper, and then of course, when I
transcribe it
for the performers, nobody wants to read what I just showed you.
You keep all the paper with all the ideas?
I do, yeah. In fact, I'm now wrestling what to do with all of the paper that my dad left to me. He left almost 100 scores in manuscript form in 8 crates, and I have nowhere to put them. So
No, scanning could be a good way to store.
Well, yeah. Looking for volunteers. That's what we're ultimately going to do. But it's a pretty painful process, because first of all, there is 8 crates worth of stuff, and it is organized, but there still is stuff to go through and figure out, and then scan, and then you've got all this paper, this living substance, and it's kind of my last connection in some ways, physical connection with my dad. So it's hard to think of throwing it out. But I'm doing the same favor for my son. keeping a closet filled with papers and USPS envelopes marked, this manuscript or that manuscript, and God bless him if he just throws it out. I hope he can, because I sure can't.
I always feel like writing on paper feels so different. Than doing software. I also made me think of, like, I had a doctor who, unlike any other doctors, just wrote his notes, in his book. I always felt like he's a real doctor, he doesn't type things into the computer.
Yeah.
It's that kind of feeling.
I sometimes, because I feel this way, sometimes I wonder if it's a generational thing. I wonder if we're the people now saying, when I went to school, I used to walk 5 miles uphill, and candy bars were 5 cents. Yeah, and sometimes I feel that way when I'm talking to students, or Um,
It's
just that
true though.
I'm holding on to, these old values, and maybe, it is time to catch up with the times. But at the same time, there are ways that we can be part of, what is current and what is happening now, and there are things that we can hold on to that were, valuable. And yeah, I feel the same way. I feel like when things are on paper and, somebody's actually applied their hand to it, it communicates more.
And I find it's a different process because everything is about speed nowadays, right? The last 20, 30 years, it's like what's the fastest and what's the
Right.
the best is usually described, but what's the fastest? And
Right.
I think the creative process is never the best, is never the fastest. So the action of actually writing it down, painstakingly writing every note, is the opposite of speed. And I think that itself is a representation of what our work is, takes so many years for us to practice and
Right.
takes so many years of training for you to get where you are now. So speed isn't what we're looking for. So
And that's a hard conflict to resolve, that what the world expects and what the music expects, because yeah, we are, often faced with this idea of, oh, look at this person who learns a concerto a week, or, or look at that composer who, just wrote 20 new works last year, and it's like, it's become, Olympics for everything now. There's got to be a new world record set for everything, and but you can't put a price on, something that has been really, painstakingly thought through, and something that's truly earnest, in its expression. um, so yeah, I mean, I can certainly, even, as a player, learn a piece of music in a couple of days, but I would never play it for anybody until, I'd performed it several times, and, and really gotten to the level where I feel like, okay, I have something to say with this now. I don't want to bother you with my practice room habits. Um,
and I think time is an interesting thing. Like
mm,
earlier, you were referring to time and reflecting in a more philosophical, sense. And the time is, as we think about it, it's very absolute, right? The second, the minute, it ticks away, and then there's a day and the week. But it's interesting. I always remembered when I was learning for the second or third time of the Messiaen quartet for the end of time, and the last movement is so stressful because eighth movement, I'm by myself with Winston, and I'm thinking, how do I really, it's the combination of the previous seven movements and lead into this, how do I play it in a way that I can justify? And it's not a melody that's like the cello movement that's so
right.
beautiful and so intuitive, right? It's not a melody that I listen to it and I say, wow, that was beautiful. So again, that was a movement that I had to spend time and to convince myself in an emotional and intellectual way. And tempo marking was awful, as you know, 8:36 or something. And
Not
I
even on the metronome.
yeah, I did do metronome, and my daily practice of that movement required me to do it a few times with metronome, just so that I can, in a way that measure my own perception of time.
Yeah.
It wasn't even about learning the notes. Notes are not difficult, and I took notes after each playthrough, just to. It was interesting how
Hmm.
me as a performer had a different sense of time each time I play through it. One time it seemed like eternity, and the other time it would be like, "Wow, that was over," And it really made me reflect on what a great composition that is. It's not only spiritual in a way that how it's written, when it's written, and the situation where he was in, but also the impact it has on a performer, and it really changed my perception of time. It's like, okay,
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. Because I mean, I too, I'm thinking about time. I mean, that's what happens as we get older, and we're like, Oh crap! But also, I'm very interested in physics and quantum mechanics and the how the relativity of time and space and as it pertains to music, I feel like there is an inverse proportion between attention and time. Um, the more involved you are in the process of making the music, and that can be more or less depending on the day, depending on your mood, depending on what you're needing and wanting to play, but the more attention you have there and you're in that moment, the less time it feels like. Whereas when you've got other things on your mind and you're not 100% present, it feels like a short piece could feel like an eternity. So there, in addition to this idea that the relative motion between things has this effect on actual time, I believe perception too. Um, because I mean, we all know as we get older, it seems like time speeds up, right? And there is some link between perception and time in that particular case, because now we've run the gamut of experiences that this life has to offer a certain number of times. And now we think of them, not as instantaneous moments, but as, kind of grouped events. Much in the way when you learn how to read, you start with phonics and work your way to paragraphs. Um, you go from, wow, each sound is this event to, oh, I understand the meaning of this paragraph. And so like things start to speed up because you have this, this more kind of overarching perception. So I would apply that to the experience of playing too. When you have this broader perception of a piece of music and from the first note that in measure 76 where it's going to be, it does feel like the time passes much more quickly. Oh.
On the same idea of why we feel as we get older,
Mm-hmm.
time goes faster. There's another theory though. I
Oh,
don't agree with that one, but it's based on memory, like our accumulative memory. So if you are, let's say, not at seven, let's just use a example of a child with 7 days old. One day is 1/7 of his life,
yeah,
and then now we are, I don't know, I can't even count.
yeah. Get out your
I don't
calculators.
want to count the years even. So let alone days, but one day is a really minuscule proportion.
Proportion.
Yeah. So that
Right.
was the theory. It's like, one day or our perception of time is actually a percentage of our cumulative memory.
Yeah, that's very cool.
I have a lot about.
It's still moving pretty slow for Dan.
Very lucky then. I feel like
I'm trying to look more like him.
I'm so young, so you should celebrate
Well, so do you, so let's have a party.
that.